People make excuses for mankind generally. Why does God allow all this evil to go on in the world? They're doing it to cushion themselves against blame in particular. What they really mean is, why does God allow terrible things to happen in my life? And they're not willing to admit their sin and confess and forsake. But every knee will bow someday. Every tongue will confess sooner or later. All will be humbled in the end. The only question is, will you be humbled by God's word, or will you be humbled by his wrath? Those are your two options. You'll either be humbled by his word, or you'll be humbled by his wrath. You don't get to choose whether you'll get humbled. It will happen. The only question is, how will it happen? By his word or by his wrath? And then he says, for I have rebelled against his commandment. You know how a person responds to God's judgment has everything to do with the outcome. If God smites some group of sinners with a plague and they refuse to confess their sin, or that it's God's judgment upon them, if they refuse to admit that it is indeed a sin, if they're proud of their sin, if they display it in the streets, and then they're doing what Romans 2 verse number 5 calls, after their hardness and impenitent heart, they're treasuring up unto themselves wrath against the day of wrath and righteous judgment of God. If sinners refuse to accept blame for their own judgment, who do they tend to blame if they're not going to accept blame themselves? Who do they tend to try and deflect the blame onto? God, exactly. And anytime sinners try to blame God for the trials of life, they're simply deflecting blame that rightly belongs to them. Does that sound to you like a productive way to deal with your guilt? Does it sound like a realistic way to deal with your guilt? No, it's not. It's not productive. It's not realistic. But if they say, as Jerusalem does here, the Lord is righteous, I have rebelled against his commandment, then they're taking the first step toward cleansing and healing. Jerusalem's confession here is critical to her return 70 years later. If they didn't confess their sin, if they didn't admit they're wrong, if they didn't declare God righteous, then there wouldn't be any return 70 years later.